At 7:55 on a Sunday morning, a British Airways jet touched down at Southampton Airport. The first officer made the landing alone. The captain's seat was empty. Captain Tim Lancaster was outside the aircraft. His upper body was pinned against the fuselage. His legs were still trapped inside the cockpit, and a cabin crew member was holding him by the ankles. Everyone believed the captain was dead. He was not. 22 minutes earlier, British Airways Flight 5390 had been climbing peacefully above southern England. It was June 10th, 1990. The BAC One-Eleven had left Birmingham at 7:20 in the morning, carrying 81 passengers, 4 cabin crew members and 2 pilots on a scheduled flight to Málaga, Spain. Captain Lancaster was handling the aircraft. First Officer Alastair Atchison sat beside him. The takeoff had been completely normal. The pilots established the climb, released their shoulder harnesses and began settling into what should have been a routine flight. Behind them, the cabin crew prepared to serve drinks and a meal. 13 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft passed 17,300 feet. Then, the cockpit exploded. There was a deafening bang. The cabin filled with white condensation mist. The flight deck door was torn from its position and thrown across the radio and navigation console. The captain's windscreen had vanished. Cabin pressure rushed through the opening, with enough force to pull Tim Lancaster out of his seat and drive him headfirst through the window frame. His torso disappeared outside. His legs remained inside. The aircraft dipped and rolled as his body struck the control column. Cabin crew member Nigel Ogden rushed into the cockpit and grabbed Lancaster around the waist before the airflow could take him completely. The chief steward fought through the wreckage of the flight deck door and cleared it away from the controls. First Officer Atchison regained control of the aircraft. But he now faced 2 emergencies at once. The cabin had suffered explosive decompression, and the man who should have been flying beside him was hanging outside the plane. Atchison began a rapid descent toward breathable air. The roar inside the cockpit was so violent that he could barely hear air traffic control. Loose papers and debris flew through the flight deck. Cold air blasted through the missing windscreen. Behind him, the crew tried to pull the captain back inside. They could see his head and torso through the side window, pressed against the outside of the aircraft by the slipstream. They pulled. Nothing happened. The airflow was simply too powerful. Lancaster's right leg had become trapped between the cockpit structure and the control column. His left leg was wedged against the seat cushion. That accidental position may have prevented him from being ejected completely, but his body kept slipping farther through the opening. Ogden's arms began losing strength. His hands were going numbness from the cold, and the windscreen frame was bruising his arms. Another cabin crew member took over, strapped himself into the jump seat, and gripped both of the captain's legs. Lancaster moved another 6 to 8 inches outside. The crew member held him by the ankles for the rest of the flight. Nobody knew whether the captain was alive. His face had been exposed to freezing air and violent aerodynamic forces. He was no longer responding. The crew feared that they were holding a dead man. But letting go was unthinkable. The captain could strike the tail or enter an engine, so they held on. In the cabin, the remaining crew ordered the passengers to fasten their seatbelts and take emergency positions. Some passengers cried, others prayed. They knew something catastrophic had happened, but they could not see the impossible scene only meters away. Atchison descended to 10,000 feet and slowed the aircraft. He requested radar guidance to the nearest suitable airport. Air traffic control directed him toward Southampton. He had to fly, communicate, navigate, and prepare an unfamiliar emergency landing, while the wind screamed through the cockpit and the captain's body remained outside the window. At 7:55, Flight 5390 approached runway 02. Atchison completed the landing and brought the aircraft to a stop. The engines were shut down. The passengers left through the front and rear stairs. Emergency crews climbed aboard and finally pulled Captain Lancaster back through the windscreen. Then came the first impossible revelation. He was alive. Lancaster had fractures in his right arm and wrist, a broken left thumb, bruising, frostbite, and severe shock. One cabin crew member had cuts and bruising. The other crew members and passengers had escaped without serious physical injury. But survival was only half the mystery. Investigators still needed to explain how an airliner windscreen could simply leave the aircraft. The answer began about 27 hours before takeoff. The captain's windscreen had been replaced during maintenance. Unlike many aircraft windows that are fitted from inside and supported by cabin pressure, the BAC One-Eleven windscreen was attached from the outside by 90 countersunk bolts. The new window looked secure. It was not. Investigators discovered that 84 of the 90 bolts were smaller in diameter than the manufacturer required. The wrong bolts could enter the anchor nuts and appear to fit, but they did not have enough grip to resist the pressure inside the aircraft. The maintenance manager had selected replacement bolts, largely by comparing them with an old bolt by eye and touch, instead of confirming the correct part in the catalog. Warnings and visual clues were missed. Unsuitable tools and working conditions made the task more difficult. Most importantly, the installation was not independently inspected before the aircraft carried passengers. At 17,300 feet, the pressure difference finally tested the repair. The bolts failed. The windscreen blew outward. Investigators estimated that the forces acting on the captain were equivalent to more than 5,000 pounds. Yet the official report did not reduce the disaster to one wrong bolt or one careless decision. It described a chain of poor practices, mistaken judgments, and missed opportunities. Any one of those links, if caught in time, could have prevented the accident. The crew then broke that chain in the opposite direction. One person grabbed the captain, another cleared the controls, another took his place when his colleague could no longer hold on, and one pilot flew a damaged aircraft to safety alone. Every person on board survived. But the final twist came 5 months later. Tim Lancaster returned to flying. The captain, who had spent the landing outside his own aircraft, went back into the cockpit and continued his career. A windscreen disappeared. A pilot followed it. The crew held his ankles, and somehow nobody died. True story, impossible ending. What the? Subscribe to Once Upon a WTF for documented stories, with endings no screenwriter would dare invent. Because next time, American soldiers and German soldiers will stand on the same castle wall, fighting the SS together. You think the Second World War had clear sides. The Battle of Castle Itter is about to prove you wrong.